And welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
And I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, President Biden condemns violence on campus.
Meanwhile, the White House tries to soften Biden's comments on Japan.
And Hamas uses hostages as human shields.
But before all that, let's start with an update on Arizona's abortion bill. Governor Katie Hobbs signed the repeal of the 1864 abortion ban into law today. We've mentioned before that the Civil War-era legislation would have banned abortion in almost all cases, a law that the state Democrats would not accept. The repeal passed through the GOP majority Senate with all 14 Democrats and 2 Republicans voting in favor of the repeal. Now that the governor signed the legislation, the state will likely keep its 15-week abortion limit in place. However, the repeal will only take effect after the Arizona legislature adjourns later in the year, so the Civil War-era abortion ban could remain in place for some time.
Meanwhile, shifting to those campus riots where police have arrested at least 2,000 people in relation to the dozens of anti-Israel protests and, as I said, riots at colleges across the country. Crews, as we speak, are currently cleaning up the tent encampment at UCLA. Riot police broke through a crude barricade at the site yesterday morning, making around 200 arrests. Most of them face misdemeanor charges for failing to disperse. And meanwhile, New York City officials say that nearly half of those arrested at Columbia University and City College this week were actually not students at either of those schools. This comes as Mayor Eric Adams has warned of what he called outside agitators radicalizing students.
And in light of the ongoing riots, President Biden finally voiced his disapproval of the issue. Here's a brief clip from his speech yesterday.
We are not an authoritarian nation where we silence people or squash dissent. The American people are heard. In fact, peaceful protest is in the best tradition of how Americans respond to consequential issues. But neither are we a lawless country. We are a civil society, and order must prevail.
He also added that violent protests and intimidation are not protected by law, while at the same time he also said there is no place for any other racial attacks either, including on Palestinian and Arab Americans. However, the president also rejected the need for the National Guard to deal with the protests. Meanwhile, when White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked why the president hadn't spoken up about the protests sooner, she evaded the question and affirmed Biden's commitment to stop anti-Semitism instead.
The president has been no other president has spoken about anti-Semitism than this president.
But that's not the question. It's the protest.
And I'm answering it in the way that I believe is the best way to answer your question, which is the president has been very, very clear. He's been clear about this. He's taken action. He put forth a strategic plan to counter anti-Semitism.
Meanwhile, President Biden is taking flack for recent comments about Japan, calling the country xenophobic. During a campaign reception on Wednesday, Biden lumped Japan together with China, India, and Russia, saying their economies are suffering because they don't want immigrants.
Look what's going on. Look what's going on in Japan. Japan is in a position where traditionally women are as well educated as men, but the tradition was once they had a child, they were to drop out of the job market. Well, I spent a lot of time with President Abe as vice president, and guess what? It's called Abe economics they're talking about it, we're calling it. And that is, there's an entire move, because they are xenophobic, because they do not want to invite other people from outside their country to come in and make up the workforce. They have fewer workers than they have a need for workers. And so what they've done is they've decided to encourage women to stay in the job market.
Biden compared Japan's economy to America's, which he said is growing because of immigration. Following blowback for criticizing an American ally, the White House then tried to somewhat soften Biden's comments.
Look, the president was very clear, and I think...
He wasn't very clear. I mean, that's why we're asking you.
Well, look, here's what I'm saying. He was talking about who we are as a country, right? He was talking about the importance about being in a country of immigrants, especially as you see the attacks that we have seen very recently in the last couple of years on those attacks on immigrants in particular.
Now, the criticism comes at an odd time for the president, as just a few weeks ago, he hosted Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in D.C., where Biden said the American-Japanese alliance is stronger than it's ever been.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump seems to be narrowing the timeline for announcing his running mate. He remained coy on Wednesday when a reporter asked him about his top picks for vice president, but he did suggest he would make the announcement leading up to the Republican National Convention.
Who's on your short list? Doug Burgum, Tulsi Gabbard? Who are you looking at?
I mean, all good names. We were speaking before, all good names. We have
Marco Rubio?
Marco's great. I think he's been great.
Is he one of your tops?
Well, he's one of the people I respect. I can tell you that Marco's been great. But so many people ask that question. Usually it's done right around the convention. So it's going to be done, and maybe it'll be done before you, because here we are in Wisconsin.
Bloomberg claims insider knowledge of who the former president is considering. The Trump campaign rejected this, saying the only one who knows the short list is Donald Trump. The GOP summit will be held in Milwaukee, July 15th through the 17th. And up next, the Pentagon admits to a mistaken drone strike and other international coverage when we come back from break.
Many mothers find strength in the experience of giving birth as they overcome physical challenges and embrace the journey of bringing a new life into the world. You can help an abortion-minded mother receive discipleship, encouragement, and the strength needed to have her baby. During the month of May, you can bless your mom for Mother's Day by giving to Preborn on your mother's behalf. Go to preborn.com/FISM to give. That's preborn.com/FISM.
When it comes to money, I always have so many questions. I never know where to go to get answers to those questions. They never really teach you this stuff in school, like some of the best ways to handle it, how to save, when to invest, where to invest, even just what to do with the money. And if I put it in the stock market, what's the best way to protect from losing it all? That fear can be paralyzing. You don't really know what decisions to make. As a Christian, I don't want to give my money to people who are going to use it for things that God hates. When I discovered financial issues, it was like a burden was lifted off my shoulders. Not only did I gain access to a simple investment strategy that I can manage myself, I also have the peace of mind that my money will not be going to companies that actively promote things that God hates. Financial issues has allowed me to experience peace in my investments.
Invest your money in a God-honoring way. Go to financialissues.org.
When a woman experiences an unplanned pregnancy, she's faced with a difficult decision. Preborn connects with life-affirming pregnancy clinics across the nation and provides them with free ultrasound sessions for expectant mothers. When a mother sees her baby on an ultrasound and hears their heartbeat, it doubles the chance she'll choose life. Visit preborn.com/life to save a baby's life.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kiss. Well, let's continue our coverage with the Pentagon. The U.S. military admitted yesterday that they mistakenly killed a Syrian civilian in a 2023 drone strike, which was meant to target a senior al-Qaeda leader. The U.S. Central Command said they cannot share more information on it since it's classified. However, the investigation, which concluded last November, revealed that while the military abided by the proper laws and U.S. policies in an armed conflict, it could have improved several issues. They added, quote, "We are committed to learning from this incident and improving our targeting processes to mitigate potential civilian harm."
And elsewhere, Iran is now bragging about last month's attack on Israel, saying it could launch an even bigger attack in the future. The Institute for the Study of War released its Iran update this week, and according to the ISW, several Iranian military leaders boasted on May 1st that they could strike Israel with a drone and missile attack much larger than what they launched on April 13th, and thus inflict greater damage on Israel. Israel, along with the help from the U.S. and other allies, intercepted about 99% of Iran's drones and missiles last month, But Iranian generals are now suggesting they could have launched an additional 2 or 3 rounds of those attacks, which would have been much more difficult to defend against. In fact, Iran claims it only used 20% of its strength during that attack. The ISW suggests that Iranian leaders are likely studying their April 13th attack to learn lessons and understand how to more effectively penetrate U.S. and partner air defenses in the future.
Meanwhile, Turkey stopped all trade with Israel yesterday over a worsening humanitarian tragedy in Gaza, in their words. The country's trade ministry says it will strictly cut off all Israeli imports and exports until more humanitarian aid flows into the war-torn Palestinian region. Israeli officials accused Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan of breaking trade agreements, firing back, saying this is how a dictator behaves. The countries traded nearly $7 billion worth of goods last year. Israel will now look to local production and other countries to fill that trade gap. On that same day, the U.S. called on Israel to protect 8 shipments. This comes after Israeli settlers attacked a shipment from Jordan. Authorities arrested 3 people involved in the attack, but the State Department says Hamas later stole that shipment following its arrival in Gaza.
Ultimately, the UN is either in the process or has by now recovered that aid, but it was an unacceptable act by Hamas to divert this aid to begin with, to seize this aid. We have made clear that it's an unacceptable act. I think the UN partners will be also making clear that it's an unacceptable act.
Spokesperson Matthew Miller added, quote, "This is the first widespread case of diversion the U.S. has seen."
Still in Gaza, we have some very disturbing news. Reports suggest Hamas's leader is using hostages as human shields. According to the New York Times, the very mastermind behind the October 7th terror attack, a man by the name of Yahya Sinwar, is currently surrounding himself and his family with more than a dozen hostages. U.S. officials say the hostages are meant to prevent Israel from trying to assassinate him. Israel blames Sinwar for preventing a hostage deal, and this latest revelation, that is, about his use of human shields could be a major reason why Hamas keeps stalling in negotiations. Hamas is still holding more than 130 hostages, though it's actually unclear how many are still alive. In fact, Israel says about a quarter of them could be dead.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is accusing Russia of using banned chemical weapons in Ukraine following a new set of sanctions. The State Department announced Wednesday that there is evidence of chloropicrin and other banned chemicals being used against Ukrainian troops. Moscow previously denied accusations of violating an international treaty. However, the State Department warns the use of the World War I-era gas is not an isolated incident. In response to the investigation, the U.S. slapped Russian defense companies and individuals with more than 300 sanctions. U.S. officials say they will further disrupt and degrade Russia's war efforts. But the State Department is stopping short of labeling Russia a terrorist organization, according to Matthew Miller, whom we just saw.
We have not changed our position with regard to that designation, but it in no way changes the actions that we have taken to hold Russia accountable. You've seen since the outset of this conflict, the United States imposing sanctions on Russia, imposing export controls on Russia. We imposed new sanctions on Russia yesterday.
And before we go to break, women's basketball star Brittany Griner is opening up about her painful 10 months spent in a Russian prison after being arrested on drug charges in 2022. During an interview on ABC yesterday, the Olympic gold medalist described the appalling conditions.
Brittany is handcuffed, then brought to a police station where she says she is locked in a 7-by-7 cell with a metal bed and a hole in the ground for the toilet.
You had very few possessions that you were able to take into the cell with you.
I had a couple of shirts, a couple of pair of sweats, the shoes on my feet. One of my shirts, I ripped it up, and I used one to clean myself. I used one as my toilet paper.
And that was actually before she was sent to an even worse penal colony where she says spiders infested her hair. She simply said, "I had to do what I had to do to survive." And up next, we have plenty more news to get to, but first, let's go to a moment in history.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. In this episode, let's go back to the early years of the American experience and explore one of the founding fathers of our country. He was, like Washington and Jefferson before him, a Virginian who would serve in the Continental Congress as a young man and later in life would serve the country as president. He would guide the nation through the difficult and often overlooked war with Britain in the early 1800s, known as the War of 1812. He would also later be known as the father of the Constitution, the fourth president of the United States, James Madison. Now, Madison was born in 1751 in Orange County, Virginia, where he would enter the political sphere as a young man. He would serve on the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, and in the years after the Revolutionary War, Madison was one of the most influential voices in the Constitutional Convention, where the United States Constitution was drafted and created. And it was here that he would earn his nickname, the Father of the Constitution, this being for his vital role that he played in this preeminent founding document of the nation. Now, it should be noted, Madison was not one to hog the credit for the document's founding, as he would later credit its creation as the work of many heads and many hands, in his own words. Now, in the years following Washington's inaugural administration, two dueling political factions would arise to power in the Union. One was the pro-English system spearheaded by Alexander Hamilton, and the other was much more French and had at its head Thomas Jefferson. It was this Jeffersonian sect that Madison took to, and sure enough, he would serve under Jefferson as Secretary of State during his presidency. Now, Madison would follow his political ally Jefferson in the Oval Office. He was elected commander-in-chief in the 1808 election and would serve for 2 terms. During his presidency, the nation would begin to take a role on the world stage among the European powers. And this was poignantly shown in 1812 when, after several years of tense trade relations with the British Empire, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain, as the young nation would enter a rematch with the most powerful empire in the world. Now, though history does not reveal that the U.S. openly won the War of 1812, they certainly didn't lose it. Both sides inflicted equal damage, proving to the world that the U.S. could stand against the great powers of the world and survive. And also, great patriotic fervor grew out of this conflict, including the creation of the poem that would become the national anthem. You can check out another moment in history for that one. Madison's administration continued to serve the steady growth of the Union, and he would spend the last years of his life at his Montpelier, Virginia plantation before his death in 1836. Thanks so much for joining me once again for a moment in history.
There are moments in life that define us. Choices determine the courses we take. Choices that create life, or those that save a life. And some make life worthwhile. There are decisions to stay, or to go, to remain the same, or to grow. Sometimes we pray and make peace. Other times we take a stand for what we believe. In celebration, mourning, triumph, and defeat, we are invested in every decision we seek. Despite differences, we have one thing in common: the desire to do all for the glory of God. Keep your wallet aligned with your heart and your investments in harmony with your faith. Timothy Plan, biblically responsible mutual funds, ETFs, and retirement plans. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Read carefully before investing.
For $28, you can sponsor an ultrasound scan that will enable an abortion-minded woman to hear the heartbeat of her baby. 90% of the time when this happens, that sound will change a woman's mind and cause her to keep the baby. And guess what? An anonymous donor is matching your gift. For every 200 scans underwritten, an ultrasound machine will be purchased and placed in a life-saving preborn clinic. Go to preborn.com/FISM to give today. That's preborn.com/FISM.
Welcome back to FISM News. Well, we begin this segment with a somber update on the Baltimore Bridge collapse. ABC News reports that the 5th victim's body was found trapped in a red truck yesterday. The Maryland Department of State Police said that they remain dedicated to the ongoing recovery operations, while knowing behind each person lost in this tragedy lies a loving family. They added that they're asking that everyone extend their deepest sympathies and support to the families during this difficult time. Meanwhile, one more victim is still yet to be found as of this report.
It's truly tragic, and it just goes to show that it must have been such an impressive wreckage under the water there that it's been, what, a month now, and they still haven't gotten everyone out. It's just horrific and tragic.
Yeah, it's truly heartbreaking.
Meanwhile, we turn to a story that's raising some eyebrows where a second Boeing whistleblower has died this week. 45-year-old Joshua Dean died on Tuesday after a brief struggle with a fast-moving infection. Now, Dean had raised safety concerns about Boeing, claiming the company was ignoring manufacturing defects on the 737 MAX. Dean's death comes only 2 months after the death of another whistleblower, a man by the name of John Barnett, who had apparently shot himself. An investigation into his death is still ongoing. Dean and Barnett came forward along with 2 others after an incident back in January when a Boeing 737 MAX 9's door plug blew off while in mid-air. Boeing was then forced to ground all of its MAX 9 jets, and the FAA is investigating the incident as well. Meanwhile, Boeing's CEO has also announced he will step down at the end of the year.
Truly a disturbing story there. And in other national news, crossing with some politics here, House Republicans are once again putting pressure on the Biden administration over the border crisis. FISM's Ian Patrick gives us those details.
As the 2024 presidential election fast approaches, Republicans have been aggressively attacking Democrats on multiple different fronts in order to sway votes their way. This includes the campus protests that we have talked about quite recently, the abortion legislations, and the economy overall. But one issue that Republicans have been harping on since day one of the Biden administration has been the border crisis. And they recently continued in that campaign. This week, the House of Representatives passed Resolution 1112, which denounces the Biden administration's immigration policies. The resolution text singles out what it calls, quote, the worst border security crisis in the nation's history. It blames this problem on the Biden administration's day one actions in dismantling, quote, effective border security measures and interior immigration enforcement. It also references various crimes carried out by illegal aliens as part of backing up their argument, including the tragic murder of Georgia nursing student Laken Riley. The resolution further urges the Biden administration to rescind its, quote, open borders policies and to implement new ones to end the border crisis. It passed with a vote of 223 to 191, with 13 Democrats overall joining in with all Republicans. On a more local level, the state governments along the border wall are taking their own enforcement actions against the crisis. And just this week, the state of Oklahoma, though not on the border, joined these states by enacting a law which would criminalize illegal immigration. House Bill 4156 makes living in Oklahoma as an illegal immigrant a misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in county jail or a fine. Those found in violation of the law are required to leave within 72 hours or to be then convicted of a felony. Republican Governor Kevin Stitt signed the bill on Tuesday, saying he was, quote, disappointed that the bill was necessary. State Democrats argue that the bill is unconstitutional, however, because border security is up to the federal government alone. And in fact, this law is similar to one in Texas, which is currently being challenged in federal court. And immigration data continues to show how much the border crisis has grown out of control. Data gathered by Restoration News displays the amount of illegal aliens who were arrested and the types of crimes of which they were convicted. According to this data, there were 528 arrests in just April of this year alone. According to their findings, 42 of these arrests were directly related to sexual assaults as well, a concerning statistic. Since February of this year, Restoration News reports 1,400 crimes committed by illegal aliens within the nation. And that data was found through open source records, but Restoration does acknowledge that there are many more crimes that aren't being reported for either one reason or another. This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks so much for that report, Ian. Always important to get those updates. Meanwhile, continuing with some political news here, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders is now ordering her state to ignore Biden's expansion of Title IX, joining Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Biden's education department announced the changes last month, expanding Title IX protections to also include gender identity. For example, it could now be considered discriminatory to deny transgender students access to the bathrooms of their choice, among other things. Sanders signed an executive order yesterday telling schools to keep on following state laws that bar students from using facilities of the opposite gender and prohibiting teachers from using students' or other minors' preferred pronouns. She says the Biden administration is trying to, quote, unilaterally rewrite federal law to advance its radical gender ideology against women and girls.
Meanwhile, in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis is banning lab-grown meat. Here he is explaining why.
They want to basically eliminate meat. They want to eliminate cattle. They want to eliminate chickens, all this stuff. And they want to create protein in laboratories. And their goal is to get to a point where you will not be raising cattle, where you will not be developing meat like we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years in the state of Florida.
DeSantis went on to say that the goal of these producers isn't simply market competition. He said their motives are to put farmers out of business.
And so it's not just a question of, oh, well, they want to put this out there on the market. If some people like it, they can do it. That's not really what they're going for, because they know if that was put out there to compete with normal beef, that they would lose. So why don't you just phase that out?
According to the governor, this is the latest move of the World Economic Forum-driven agenda that wants to blame climate change on farm animals, a fact supported by the WEF itself. Now, DeSantis said at a separate press conference that this is really a vision of imposing restrictions on freedoms for everyday people, while these elites are effectively pulling the strings, calling the shots, and doing whatever they want to do in their own lives.
The idea is so downright creepy, but at the same time, I have to admit, I'm so morbidly curious that if someone presented me some lab-grown meat, I'd be like, you know, I might have to try it just to know.
Yeah, same here. I think it would be an interesting novelty, but not at the expense of real meat. So.
Right. If someone was going to force this down your throat, yeah, no thanks. But maybe, you know, it's kind of like a dare or a fear factor type thing. That might be fun just once.
It's intriguing.
Yeah. Yes, right. All right, and we end with this fascinating story. I think it's fascinating, at least. For the first time ever, scientists have now seen an animal in the wild using a medicinal plant in order to treat his injury. This week, researchers shared findings of a Sumatran orangutan applying chewed up plant leaves to an open wound, and it actually appears he knew somewhat what he was doing, as the wound was fully healed 8 days later. Now, the plant in question is used by locals for various treatments, including pain for inflammation, but it's rarely eaten by orangutans in the wild. The author of this study, which was published in Scientific Reports this week, she said, quote, "It shows that orangutans and humans share knowledge." She said, "Since they live in the same habitat, I would say that it's quite obvious, but still intriguing to realize." You know, it's just one of those things. I see this, I'm like, oh my gosh, they actually know how to do these things. It really is incredible to watch.
Yeah, I just marvel at God's creation and how he just has given, you know, this knowledge to some of the mammals who are a little bit higher than some other animals.
Yeah, I'm an animal lover too, so any story like this is really going to catch my eye. So I think it's cool.
It's fascinating, truly. All right, well, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please visit FISMnews.tv for more content.
And for more updates until Monday, be sure to check us out on social media or download the FISM app. We'll see you on Monday.